Rain from heaven above with me. They're all scratched out. Stephen, could I ask you in a couple of minutes to lead us in a word of prayer? Thank you. What did he say about me? Oh, God's creature. I thought he said that's God's preacher. I thought, oh, that's the nicest thing he said to me, but God's creature makes more sense. Look, he's getting it outside. When did you see that? He wouldn't kill it. The Bible says spiders live in the king's house. And it's a one vote, one person, and Wendy's the one person with the one vote. All right, well, let's get our Bibles out tonight. We are in 2 Samuel 17. Appreciate that Gregor covered class for us last time. I know he didn't get as far as we'd hoped. Not sure how I'm going to handle it. If we'll try to compress everything and get it done in December. I do have a new class to kind of run by all the guys this Sunday. We pick up in January, but we'll just kind of see how it goes, whether we can compress it all in or if we have to add a class. I don't mind either way. So I do think what we're talking about is very interesting. I just find it fascinating right now in the midst of this rebellion that we're in. As I was reading through it again tonight, I was thinking about the fact that, you could almost make a really good movie out of this story because it highs and lows, and there's a stitch at the end, a surprise ending. It just really is a striking story for what's going on. So excited to get to be here and talk about these things before we get started. Stephen, would you lead us?
He's watching with those who couldn't make it tonight, and he's also watched those that are sick. Please allow us again to be edified and to learn from your word tonight. In Jesus' holy name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Stephen. So, where are we at? Well, we remember last week we were talking about Absalom's rebellion, and Absalom's rebellion was really given a great deal of weight whenever Ahithophel joins in, and he is the advisor whose advice is like the wisdom of God. That's really a remarkable thing. And I think I mentioned to you a few weeks ago that it seems likely that he's the person that they're talking about when David says that friend of mine that broke bread with me has now raised his hand against me, and just talks about how bitter it was that this close friend of his had betrayed him. We also talked about what might have motivated Ahithophel, and that might have well been something that David had done. So that's a pretty serious thing for us to think about. Ahithophel has advised him to shame David, and he did that in the last chapter. And now in chapter 17, Ahithophel is again giving advice. So Ahithophel lays out how the plan of attack ought to come. But another advisor is brought in, and this is the advisor Hushai. Now, where did he come from again? Do you guys remember? I haven't been here a while. I've been paying attention. Where's Hushai from? Hushai has an interesting backstory. Was he one of the guys that was all behind Absalom? He's a spy. Yeah. Like I said, again, intrigue. That's what makes this story so interesting. So chapter 17, Ahithophel says, let me get 12,000 men. We'll go attack. Just get right on him because he's running. He's in retreat, and we'll take him out. Now Hushai shows up, and Hushai says, no, that's terrible advice. Instead, what you ought to do is wait, and let's draw in the whole army of Israel. And that way we can get the whole army together, root them out, and get David, and then we'd be done. Now, Hushai's advice is meant to thwart Ahithophel, because Hushai is David's spy. Like I said, it's really neat. He's the spy in the camp, so to speak. He's trying to upset everything. And from that, you might get the idea that Ahithophel's advice actually was pretty good. By the way, militarily, it made a lot of sense. There's several times during the Civil War where they'll talk about the fact that there was a defeat of a great army, and they said had the other army just pursued them, they could have ended the war. So it really is a good advice to chase your enemy when they're on the run to bring them to an end. And that was Ahithophel's advice, and advice given instead. So of course we know that they follow Hushai's advice. And then it's the case that a little further on, Hushai then gives a report to Jonathan and Ahimaaz. Now, Ahimaaz, who are these young men? Jonathan and Ahimaaz? Yeah, the sons of the priest. Yeah, it's kind of interesting that, these are men that likely one day could be the high priest himself. Well, one of them will be. And so that's an interesting thing to think of these two men. So they're given the report. They flee. They get chased. They have to hide. Where did they hide? Remember where they hid? And you're reading there in chapter 17. Where did they hide? In a well. Yeah, they covered up. And, when I was a boy, I had the old picture Bible. And, I thought, these picture Bibles. Paul drew those pictures, I thought. But, I remember this story because I remember the picture of the well covered over and just how exciting that was to imagine these men hunting for them. And there they are hidden. And then they get out and they give David advice for what's going to happen. And so the next chapter will be how David uses this information. Let's look at just for a second at a map here. Here's a map of the kingdom of Israel at that time. And that red dot represents the city of Hebron. That's where the rebellion starts. And we talked about this already, that was where Absalom went and declared himself king, because who had been declared king there before? David had, yeah. So he goes back to the place where David was declared king. He declares himself king. Then he begins a march upward to Jerusalem. Now, when David hears about it, David flees Jerusalem. Remind me again, why did David flee Jerusalem? Why not hold on to Jerusalem and say, if I can? David chose not to stay in Jerusalem, chose to flee. Why? It's a characteristic of David that's a good thing. It's part of David's goodness. What did he not want to happen? George? Yes, he didn't want to see the city destroyed and all the things that were going on there destroyed. In fact, even what's interesting, whenever the priests came out with him with the Ark of the Covenant, he said, "You guys go back." I always thought that was interesting. You guys go back because you need to stay in Jerusalem, and if God's with me, I'll be back. And if he's not with me, well, you still need to be there. So I thought that was real interesting too. Kind of a fascinating view of how he saw his circumstance. So David flees Jerusalem, and then of course we read about how Absalom took Jerusalem basically without any problem. And David will cross over the Jordan River. Whenever he gets this advice from the two young men, he'll flee across the river, and Absalom's going to pursue him. Absalom across the river. But by the time he crosses the river, David has made his way all the way north to the city of Mahanaim. And there it is that David is going to, I'm going to use the word regroup. He's going to regroup his forces and put together his army. And in a sense, what we see here is that a big tactical mistake has been made. That by allowing him the time to get away rather than pursuing him, like Ahithophel had said, by allowing him to get away, now David is able to reorganize and prepare his counter assault. Well, I kind of talked about this already, but what was the advice of Ahithophel? The questions we have here. What was Ahithophel's advice? Yeah, he says, let's just get a few men, not too many, and let's go get David down. While he's on the run, run him down. Like I said, militarily, that was great advice. Hushai, what does he say? What is Hushai's advice? Yeah, don't do it. Don't do it. He says, instead, let's wait and let's let these armies build up, and he'll draw. He wants to take the time for the men to be brought together. What does he say about Ahithophel's advice? I always thought it's kind of interesting. Verse 7, Hushai says to Absalom, the advice Ahithophel is given is just no good. Just no good. I'm going to give it to Hushai. So again, like I said, spy and go before Absalom, and here's the smartest guy in the land, and say, yeah, he doesn't know what he's talking about. Let me tell you, that was some boldness. That was a bold man. To walk in there before Absalom and to make a report like this. Now, of course, then he turns around and he gives all this information. Who does he give it to again? Yeah, the two sons of the high priest who were there, they were left behind, and they were told that they would be the ones to report to David the things that they would find out. So they do, and we talked about how they escaped, where they hide, and already told us that they hid in the well during that time. Now, let's kind of camp on this next question here. After Ahithophel sees what's on here, that Ahithophel's advice is not going to be followed, what happens? Yeah, he goes home. Very specific the way the language goes, right? That is in verse 23. Ahithophel saw his advice was not followed. He saddled a donkey, arose, went home to his house, to his city. He put his household in order and hanged himself and died. How many suicides are recorded in the Bible? More? Seven. Yeah, seven. Yeah, total. Yeah. Old Testament, New Testament. Samson is kind of iffy. So we could say six. Samson's kind of an iffy. But it's interesting to study those events in the Bible and what happened there. And with Ahithophel in particular, I think his suicide is particularly interesting. The first question is, and by the way, there's not an answer in the scriptures, so I'm asking for you to kind of help me understand this. Why? Why did Ahithophel do this? What do you think, Lamar?
They've given advice to like David, so Absalom killed. He's probably going to be punished for that advice.
Oh, no, Lamar, I hadn't even thought of that, but he is considered the ultimate traitor right now. It's not Absalom that David is upset the most with. It's Ahithophel he's the most upset. I didn't even think about that, but it is a good point to say that he would be, if Absalom runs off and gets killed, which is what happens. Spoiler. That's exactly what's going to happen. That he would be on the top enemies list. I hadn't even thought about that. What else do we got? What else do you think? Why does Ahithophel take this course, Gregor?
Well, I think Ahithophel gave away some pretty before him. I mean, he did have that good piece of advice, which was to go after me. Probably would have been smart, though. The counter advice had some good points because David was a man of valor. He was known for his defeating, shall we say, but sleeping with the concubines and some of the other things he did sort of seemed to almost backfire on him, and David's part of him being pulled away from God's ear.
Yeah.
Seemed to have been fulfilled, and maybe Ahithophel saw that he was no longer in favor with God, and so he saw himself as being no longer in favor with anybody, much less, and that would have destroyed him. Obviously, it seems to destroy him to kill himself, which is a coward's way out, yes, but many people take that route.
So Gregor, one of the reasons I thought of is exactly that. I thought of, what if he is ashamed? It's a moment where now he's on the outskirts of the council. He's not the guy, and he has a moment to say, you know what have I done? I betrayed the king. Why he has this terrible remorse? What other suicide in the Bible is brought on by remorse? Judas, yeah. So Judas is I like what you said though about the idea that God's not with him anymore. We have like Saul and his armor bearer as men that perhaps their suicides were linked up to that idea. So you have that imagery as well. I really think it's interesting. Like I said, to think of the idea of a man who might be thinking, I'm so I did something terrible, and the best thing to do is just to go home and end my life. I think that's it doesn't seem to be a very emotional thing if he puts everything in order to do it. So that's interesting. What else? Anybody else have another thought? What do you think, Stephen?
Pretty much in line with what both you and Gregor said, that he knew that he betrayed David. He both David and Absalom, that was the only thing he had left going from as far as this new kingdom, and he also knew that his advice not being followed could very well lead to the consequences that it did, and certainly that was true.
So Stephen, go ahead, Monique. Oh no.
I was just going to say, I thought pride.
That was it. I was going to build off of what Stephen said and say that very word. That I wonder if the other thing I think about, he might have been remorse, but the other thing might have been pride. that here he was, the advisor, and Hushai comes in and says, he doesn't know what he's talking about, and they go with that. And the way it says it, that when Ahithophel saw his advice was, thrown out, what if it was pride? What if it was he was a man that was used to people always listening to him, always taking what he said, and they just threw it out the window, and it was devastating to his pride. And I wondered that.
I thought a little bit of humiliation.
Yeah, yeah.
Makes it public.
Yeah.
Says, oh, we thought it was better.
Yeah, and it was a very public humiliation, wasn't it? So that was the other one that I thought. I thought, was it remorse? Was it pride? Of course, what Lamar said was it, I don't want to be, arrested and, put to death in some terrible way. All of those fit. We just don't know. It's probably a great place to have an important conversation. I'll tell you what, if we have time at the end of class, we might have a little more conversation about the characteristic of suicide. Let me just plant the seed in your mind, though, for a moment, that in the Bible, every time you talk about people who commit suicide, and I said Samson is the exception, perhaps not even fitting in the category, but there are always people who, having made bad choices, can't face them and rather would face death. So it's kind of an important idea to see suicide as a characteristic of people who, having made a wreck of their lives, made these decisions. Now, on the other hand, I think a lot of times these were decisions people made that they might have been able to get out of, but they just chose not to. So it's important to kind of see these things this way. Anybody else have another thought about Ahithophel? Fascinating man to be brought to an end like this. One of the things we read there in chapter 17 that we kind of passed over is that Absalom appoints somebody as his general of the army to kind of replace Joab. Joab had gone with David. And he appoints Amasa. Now, can you tell me who is Amasa? Who is Amasa? Maybe specifically, who is Amasa in regards to David, or I'll even take who is Amasa in regards to Absalom. It tells us a little bit about who he is, and trying to find the passage here in verse 25, 26, tells us a little bit about his parentage. So who is he in regards to David? I bet you're confused right now because you see the name Abigail and you're thinking, well, that's David's wife. But there was also Abigail, David's what? Somebody said it. Sister. Very good. Yeah, so it was his sister. So if this is his sister's son, this is his nephew, or you could have said Absalom's cousin. Now, I think that's interesting that, this is a family member that's in the rebellion with Absalom that's going to lead up the army. And Amasa is going to be interesting because he's going to be a problem even after Absalom as we go on a few more chapters. So one of the things that's interesting is he draws in Amasa, and Amasa is going to be the leader of his army. And I can't help but to believe that a little bit of this defeat is perhaps Amasa wasn't a very good choice. We don't know who he was or where he came from, but he might have just been a family appointment that you could trust his loyalty versus his skill. Joab is a good general for all the virtue issues that he has. He's competent. He knows what he's doing. So David gets away, and he gets all the way up to Mahanaim. What do we know this town from? Anybody do any work into that? Some of the things you've seen it in the past. So it is a town we've talked about a couple of times in the past as a place where people have fled to before. But when David gets there, he gets help. Now, who does he get help from? Who are the people that give him help? Specifically, there's a group of people there that more or less provision his army. Who are they? Stephen? Okay, so one of them is, they're all Gileadites, I guess, but one of them is specifically who the Gileadite? I can't remember his name. We could just pull it up and read it here in verse 27. Barzillai, yeah, Barzillai, the Gileadite. Barzillai is an interesting guy. He's a rich man. We'll find out in a couple of chapters. He's a rich man. He's 80 years old. David will want him to come back to Jerusalem with him, and he'll say, "No, I'm too old. You go on. You whippersnapper, go on without me." But he doesn't want to go with David, so he's interesting. But he wants to help David. Who else? Who are the other guys? Who you got, George? Oh, Ryan. Sorry. Yeah, so what's interesting about Shobi? What's that? He's the son of Nahash. Why is he an interesting guy to be helping David? What did David do to his father and brother? George? He's an Ammonite. And what did David do to the Ammonites? Yeah, he destroyed them. Yeah. So it's kind of interesting that specifically Shobi is the brother of the king that, remember whenever the Ammonite king Nahash died and David said, I'm going to show them great honor. And the king says, they're not going to show you honor. They're spying on you. So David destroys them. That's Shobi's brother. Now, I find that very interesting that Shobi's brother was the king that David destroyed. And when he shows up, Shobi says, hey, let me help you out here. I don't know. Maybe that kind of leads you to some thoughts on.
I just wonder too if maybe he was a believer. Maybe his grandfather was a believer in some level.
Yeah, well, Nahash does help David somewhere. We don't know the story how, but it does indicate that David says he shows him kindness. Certainly that could be the case, Ryan. Absolutely it could. Who's the third person? Maker, yeah. I think George said it too, maker. Let's make up a word and we'll stick with it. Maker. We'll just say that's what it is. Yeah. Anthony, I started reading that book you gave me on how to pronounce names. You know, it looks like it's possible that I've mispronounced a lot of Bible names, but I think they just wrote them wrong in the book. That's how I'm going to take this. So the third guy, I don't know much about his story. We don't really have much information about him. So, you know, that third one isn't as interesting, but still, these three guys basically set up to provision David's army. Now, the significance of that, of course, is that they're taking a side in a civil war. That could be pretty dangerous. But it's clear, especially whenever you read later on Barzillai and his explanation of why he helps David, that these all are people that believe in David and in David's leadership. So we turn around now in chapter 18, and what happens in chapter 18 is we have David regroup his army, prepare for battle, and go off and attack. And he'll attack them in a place called the Forest of Ephraim. Anybody look that up on a map? The answer is nobody knows where the Forest of Ephraim was. About most of the commentators are going to put it on this side of the east side of the Jordan River, but you know, today there's nothing even close to a forest there, and Ephraim isn't even on this side. And yet, most of the conversations, the ancient commentators would have described the Forest of Ephraim on the eastern slopes. So it's not exactly clear where it is. I just took a stamp and said we'll put it in here near Mahanaim and say this might have been where this battle was going to be, where this great battle was. So David is going to prepare his army, get everybody together, organized, ready to fight. Ironically, we're going to talk about why David wasn't a part of that battle. And they're going to go forth and they're going to wipe out Absalom's army. They're going to just devastate Absalom's army. And of course, we're going to see how the result of all of that is in the end, the death of Absalom and how David takes that. So let's start off by talking about David's army and David's organization. So David fled with just a few hundred people, but now in Mahanaim, he's going to draw up thousands of men with him. So it seems that a lot of men are gathering to him. Again, had they followed Ahithophel's advice, maybe none of that would have happened. But now with the time, he's been able to gather his army. And how does he divide up? How does he organize his army? What does he do? Yeah. You know, I was trying to think, you know, what's the great military strategy of that? Other than it gives you two flanks, I don't know. You know, like I said, you could have a force to attack and two flanks to come at the side. I'm not sure too much more about that. And of course, he puts him under Joab, and Joab's good. Abishai, who is Abishai? You say Joab's brother or David's nephew as well, so that fits as well. And the third one under Ittai the Gittite. And the king says to the people, I'm going to go too. I'm going to go too. Now, he's going to go out there. Actually, let me jump ahead to a different question. David gives a specific order to his commanders. What does he tell them? What is the order that David gives all the men? Yes. Verse 5, deal gently with my sake for the young man Absalom. So go to war, but don't hurt Absalom. Don't hurt Absalom. What do you think is going on there with that command? What do you think David was thinking? Yeah, I don't think David was thinking, I want to capture Absalom and execute him myself. We'll get that sense at the end of the chapter. He must think there's still a way that this story could end well. You know, there's still something. What do you think that reflects in David? Yeah, well, go ahead, Grant.
He loved Absalom.
Yeah, well, it reflects his genuine love for his son.
The eternal hope of a parent.
Yeah. You know, and don't you kind of wonder if that wasn't Eli and his sons or Samuel, and you know, how many times, and yet, you know, the only guy that's actually going to see this very clearly is Joab, because I think you and I would agree, there's no way this is going to end well. It can't end well. After everything that Absalom has done, it can't end well. Go ahead.
Just had the thought that as parents, we see our children, and when they grow up, we still see them as those young children.
Yeah.
We don't see them as the person they grow into. That
Yeah.
can be like Absalom, that's trying to kill you.
Yeah.
And you always see those rose-colored glasses because you always reflect back on when they were very young and cute and the rest. But at this point, this man's a stranger and an enemy.
Yeah.
He just doesn't get it.
Yeah. You know, and it's interesting because I like what you said there about this idea of the view that he has. We talked about this before. Absalom, you know, may well have been his favorite child, you know, because the way he talks about him before, and of course you get a little sense of this later on, that great affection he has for him. What else might be motivating David? What, you know, I think one thought come to my mind is that maybe David's motivation isn't just his great love or his, you know, his looking at him as still hope. Maybe there's something else that makes David think, you know what, I really can't kill him. What do you got, George? Yes, that Absalom's rebellion is really David's own creation. David was told that this would happen by the prophet. The prophet showed up, Nathan showed up and said that this is what's going to happen. Absalom's rebellion is David's sin, the consequences thereof. That's what David was told. So I can't help but to think that, and I can get this, that David sees all this and he thinks, you know, this is my fault. David was really good about that. You know, he's going to do it in a couple more chapters whenever Israel gets numbered. And he'll say, it's my fault. I should be punished for this. He'll say at the end of this chapter, I wish I died instead of Absalom. And of course, we see that as love, but I also see a little bit of guilt that it would have been more just had David died and not Absalom, at least the way David sees it.
Remember I talked about Hannah, who really was responsible for starting this.
Yes, agreed. Yeah.
It's almost as though if David had done what Absalom had to go through to Amnon, both of the sons would have been spared.
Yeah. You know, I agree wholeheartedly that if David had done right with Amnon, it would have saved Absalom probably. Who's the other son that dies under Solomon? Is it Adonijah? I can't remember the other son. But the other son that's going to be executed later, I think that might have been avoided. Of course, the child, you know, that had David dealt appropriate with Amnon. Yeah. Had David just done something with Amnon, actually, maybe not even appropriate, but at least tried, maybe there would have been something to that. So that's good. You know, there's kind of an interesting thing. Teresa asked this question online, and it's a good question. Does David understand that he is still God's chosen as king? Well, that's a great question. If I had thought of that, I would have written that one down. Does David still understand, or does David still see himself as God's chosen king? Now, what's interesting about that question is that what did David say when he was fleeing? And remember, they were throwing rocks at him, and what did he say? Yeah, he doesn't know then. So that's interesting to me. So I can't help but to wonder, you know, he's asked God to thwart Ahithophel's wisdom, and Ahithophel's been utterly thwarted. And I can't help but to wonder, part of what's going on here is David's kind of saying, you know, if I'm meant to be king, let's be victorious. And if not, I think that's a really interesting question. You know, does David still see himself as God's chosen one? I'm not sure if he does or not, especially the way he was talking when he fled Jerusalem. So it's interesting to me to think about that. Certainly, you know, he has some guilt for that. Anybody have a thought on that? Go ahead.
It kind of seems to me that maybe by this point, chapter 18, he's a little bit more confident now that, you know, his plans are working out. You know, his spy is giving that advice, and no one's listening to Ahithophel.
Yeah.
You know, he kind of seems like he's going into battle. He thinks he's going to win. So.
I think there's been a change because specifically his great prayer was stop Ahithophel, and Ahithophel's been stopped. And I do think that that must have had some weight in his perspective. So anybody else have a thought on this? It's a really good question. Ryan, what do you got?
What we talked about too, the provision is just kind of magically showing up. That's providence.
Yeah, that's a great point. It certainly would be a providential supplying of his needs. So, again, that would be another testimony that this was, that he was still in God's favor here. So that's a really great question. And by the way, it's a great question because there's a lot of times where our circumstances in life cause us to say, have I still got God's favor? And, of course, what do we look for? Not circumstances, but what? Where do we look to know if we have God's favor? It's easy answer. Somebody said it. I know somebody said it. I heard somebody say word. We turn to the word. We don't look for the circumstances in the world around us to testify to that. We look to the word to find whether or not we're in God's favor, because that's what it means to be in faith. If we're doing the things of the word of God, Romans 10, verse 17, faith comes by hearing by the word of God. That's how we have the confidence that God is with us, not by the circumstances of the world. And that's important because David had to deal with some things like that too. And so it's important for us to see that idea. I've got another question for you, kind of stepping back for a moment. Back in verse 3, David was ready to go into battle. Verse 2, he says, I'm getting ready to take you out. All the people jump up. And why don't they want David to go to battle? What's their thought on why they don't want David running into battle? What do we got? So they didn't want David to go into battle. Why not? Why not? Monique?
They said that he was worth more than 10,000 of them.
What?
He had more value.
At first my thought was, well, I guess that's how you look at a king. But is there anything else to that about David's value? What do you got?
So if David gets killed, Absalom is going to certainly be declared king right away. And the rest of the army would not fight in that instance. So it's really important that he stays alive until he has control of the battle.
It's kind of interesting. I was thinking about what you're saying there in the sense of, what is their interest in this? And of course, if David loses the battle, David is killed and they lose the battle, which is what happens, they'll be facing serious consequences. Joab's words about this are, in chapter 19, verse 5, he's talking to David, and he says that today we saved, with the defeat of Absalom, we saved your sons and daughters, the lives of your wives, the lives of your concubines, those that are your friends. He says, there's a lot of people that got saved by this victory, and when he's talking to David about David's reaction to Absalom's death. So I think of the idea to say that maybe the people here are thinking, there's a lot at stake here, right?
I was thinking too, in a couple chapters, in chapter 21, he grew faith in battle. And he almost was killed by the Philistines, but he grew faith.
Oh, that's right, Ryan.
Right at the cusp of his ability to fight anymore.
Ryan, that is a great observation. I didn't think about that at all. But David is in his mid-50s. He'll die at 70. And we know that by his late 60s, he's in pretty bad health. The Bible will describe him, and at the end of, or actually in the beginning of 1 Kings. So Ryan, I forgot about that, but you're right. He may physically not really be able to lead the battle. That's a very interesting observation. Lamar?
Go back to chapter 17, verse 2 and 3. Ahithophel's advice was along those lines of, it says, I will come upon him while he's weary and weak and make him afraid. And all the people who are with him will flee, and I will strike only the king. Then I will bring back all the people to you. When all return except the man whom you seek, all the people will be at peace. So it goes back to that point of, let's take David out, everyone else will follow.
Yeah, which what I think is interesting about that is that, again, by taking out Absalom, that seems to take out everything too. Did it? No. Okay, well, so Stephen.
Well, if David gets killed, we're told by Joab's, recruiting David, as it says here in chapter 19, that the victory that they was trying to mourn for all people heard it, that the king is grieved for his sons, that people went by stealth into the city that day, because people who are humiliated, steal away when they flee in battle. this would have been a huge blow for the entire nation that had tried to support David.
Yeah.
His death would be unacceptable, in Joab's eyes. And frankly, David was representative of all the people with him. His death would be, would be a horrible blow to everyone.
Yes, very, very good observation. Very good. Anyone else? So they go to battle. Verse 6 of chapter 18, the people went out into the field of battle against Israel. And the battle was in the woods of Ephraim. I told you before, we're not exactly sure where that is, but it's a pretty big area because it says the people of Israel were overthrown there before the servants of David. A great slaughter of 20,000 took place there that day, for the battle there was scattered over the face of the whole countryside, and the woods devoured more people that day than the sword. The woods devoured more people that day than the sword. Somebody dropped this and broke it a moment ago. It's not working as well, so I don't know. Who's the last person to handle? Oh, Gregor might have been. Maybe.
I didn't.
Yeah. I think it's interesting to describe the battle, the wilderness. They're scattered everywhere. In the Civil War, there was a battle in 1864, the Battle of the Wilderness, and it was more or less that all the troops got into this wilderness area and lost connection with each other, and the battle was just a real mess, and for both sides. And then the wilderness caught on fire. It got me to thinking about this battle, especially when it says the woods devoured more people that day than the sword devoured. What do you think that meant? The woods devoured more people that day than the sword. I wondered about that. What do you think, George? Yeah. And one of the things I was thinking of, George, is men on horseback going in and all these trees. Of course, we see it happen with Absalom, but all of your horsemen might have, could have been thrown, all these different things could have happened to them. Remember that Absalom's military, remember his original retinue, what was it consisting of? Way back chapters before.
Chariots and runners.
Yeah, chariots and runners. Well, that's a terrible thing to have in the wilderness. So, Grant, what do you got?
I was just Absalom.
Yeah. He gets knocked off his horse. I could ask. Linda's never been knocked off a horse, I know, but any of the rest of you ride a horse get knocked off. We used to have a horse that loved to find a low branch and just knock us off and go home. She was a real stinker like that. But that's a serious thing, Grant.
One other thing I think about is it's also including people who just couldn't fight anymore. You're in a forest, you get someone who breaks their ankle or sprains their ankle or something.
Oh yeah.
Not even fight, you might not be dead.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that. I can see that happening in ravines and, your rocks and running around obstacles. You'd be a lot more likely to get injured.
Yeah, the King James, the animal that Absalom's on is a mule.
Yeah.
Mules are usually used in rough terrain or uneven terrain more than horses. So could be an indication there that it's just rough terrain and difficult to get around.
It's interesting, Lamar. I was actually wondering why a mule and not a horse. When I read through it, it didn't put it together. The idea that I know a mule is stouter, but I didn't really think about the idea of connecting that to terrain. That's a really good observation. Anyone else? So the battle goes along, and of course, as he's losing, Absalom rode out on the mule, and what happened? How did he get stuck, though? Yes. What do you think the moral of that story is? What's that? Yeah, should have ducked. Well, that's not the moral I was looking for, but that might be a pretty good moral. Moral is that guys with haircuts like Gerald and I, Tacho and I, we're a lot better off. No, what do you think we got here?
Well, I'm not sure if it's clear. He got hung up by his hair or his neck or.
That's true. That's true.
But somehow he got hung up and the mule continued. So he was left hanging one way to go.
It's interesting. This getting hung up. Left hanging between heaven and earth. I think that's just such a neat way of describing him, all hung up in the tree. It's really remarkable. So he gets hung up. Mule goes. Oh, go ahead, Grant.
I wonder if he's also unconscious because he doesn't say anything Joab.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, yeah. You know, that would actually make a lot of sense if it knocked him out or something and he's hung up there. Stephen?
I just think it's interesting that two men in the Bible have gotten tripped up by their hair.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. You know, that's interesting to think of it that way. Just how, you know, how here is this guy that's everything. What a profoundly wasted way to be caught. So they run out and they tell Joab. Joab, you know, it's the case that Absalom is there. So Joab gets mad. Why does Joab get mad at the guy that reports to him? Why does he get angry there in verse 11? Yeah, he said, "Why didn't you kill him?" And the guy says, "Yeah," he said, "David ordered us not to kill him." David said not to kill him. So why does Joab decide? Yeah, Joab says, kind of strange the way he says, "I can't linger with you." Kind of I'll be right back, and departs there with these 3 spears. Kind of interesting what he does. So he takes the spears. Verse 14 says he thrusts them through Absalom's heart, and then what? This is kind of I wonder if this is a real politic kind of moment. In other words, a decision to be political. So he runs the spears through, and then they bring down Absalom in some way. Well, you know, or actually, it doesn't necessarily imply that they took him down. But then what happened in the next verse? Verse 15. Yeah, how many of them? 10 of the armor bearers surround, and it's interesting. That's where it says they killed Absalom. So, you know, I kind of wondered here, don't know what you think, but I wondered if part of this might be if somebody's going to get in trouble, maybe we can say, well, which of us really killed him, since we all were stabbing at him. Maybe, you know, I don't think that'll help, but I wondered about this moment of execution, because it's kind of an unusual execution, to run him through with the spear, which seems like it would have killed him, but then to have the other men attack him as well, just seems kind of an overkill, unless you had a couple of purposes. What do you think, Greg? Oh, no, you didn't. Okay. Stephen?
Well, I agree with you. I see this as political killing. That Joab was clear-eyed about the entire affair. He knew what a threat Absalom was, and he wasn't going to allow David's sort of, again, rose-colored glasses to obscure the fact that Absalom was really a great threat, and what a persistent great threat.
Yeah. So here's an interesting thing to think about, Stephen. We've said this before. What is Joab's chief characteristic? He's what? He's loyal. He's more loyal to David. I hope this fits in what you said. He's more loyal to David than David is, because he's going to disobey David for David's sake. You know, and I think, like I said, it doesn't explicitly say what his reasoning is, except in the next chapter, he's going to make it clear that this is what had to happen to save everybody. But I've often seen that Joab is a guy here that he's utterly loyal to David, but he's loyal to the degree that he disobeys David. Not just once, by the way. He disobeys David, you know, occasionally. Go ahead.
Just thinking about verse 13, that his troops didn't regard him very highly. They thought he'd be betrayed.
Oh,
Said, you yourself would have set yourself against me. So his fellow troops looked at him kind of maybe as a betrayer.
That's interesting to see it that way. Ryan, I hadn't thought about that. I'm going to have to look at this some more. That's a very interesting observation you're making of that passage. Yeah.
His fellow troops, because the other troops probably knew that Job had part in killing Bathsheba's husband.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. So, you know, it's interesting to say, you know, that Joab was seen as pretty ruthless. So very interesting observation, Ryan. I hadn't thought about this before. Lamar?
Yeah, he certainly disobeyed the orders that David gave. In verse 17, after they killed Absalom, they threw him in the pit with the stones. And in Deuteronomy 21, that was a punishment for rebellious son.
Yes, isn't that interesting?
That's interesting.
You know, and I thought about that, and I thought, is Joab actually, for the first time in his life, is Joab actually looking at the law and fulfilling what the law says? I really wondered about that. You know, when I first read it, and I thought that's significant, and you find that reference to what's supposed to happen there. That was really interesting, and I wasn't sure what to make of that. So that's really good observation, Stephen.
Yeah, that's what it says in Deuteronomy 21, verses 20 through 23. Someone like this, disobedience, son, sever, rebellious. Won't obey is, of course, they want to say glutton and rubber. And all the men of the city shall stone him to death, so he shall remove the evil from their midst, and all Israel will hear of it and fear.
So let me grab a couple quick points here. George is going to the bell. I don't think he's going to give him much time. Absalom's monument. The significance here is that Absalom creates this monument because he says, I have no son to keep my name in remembrance. Now, way back in 1 Samuel or 2 Samuel chapter 14, verse 27, it said he had 3 sons. What do you think? Then now he says he has no son. I presume that's probably all it is. It's not too complicated. Probably that they all died. But it looks like the monument was built before the rebellion even. So the point they're making here is that monument is still around today. It's still reflected and seen today. I'll tell you what, we'll wrap up here. They bring the news to David, and David's response is one of the most tragic responses that there is. Verse 33, the king, when he hears the message, he's deeply moved. He went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. As he went, he said thus, "Oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." I think it's one of the most tragic laments that's in the scriptures. We'll stop here, pick up next time in the next chapter. And so read chapters 19 and 20, and actually read 19, 20, 21. We'll see if we can kind of move ourselves a little faster next time and try to get ourselves to where maybe we're finished at the end of the year. So that's our kind of our goal. And thanks for some really insightful comments. A lot of things I hadn't thought of that really kind of opened my eyes to. So I appreciate all your thoughts.